Well, now that the EU has granted the UK a 6-month Brexit delay, what happens next to try and break the deadlock? Well, MPs are now on their Easter break. Parliament shut down until the 23rd of April. And yesterday, Theresa May encouraged MPs to reflect on Brexit over their holidays. It comes after the EU Council President Donald Tusk urged the UK not to waste any time. Well, joining us to discuss more on this is Sonia Sodha, the chief leader writer at The Observer and former senior policy advisor to Ed Miliband, and Mo Hussein, the former special advisor to Amber Rudd. Thank you both for being with us today. Sonia, to you first. We've got this Brexit pause, a nice 6 months for effectively the UK to work out exactly what it wants. What chances do you give of reaching some kind of conclusion in that time?
Well, I think the difficult thing is that it's very hard to see what changes in the next 6 months. And Donald Tusk, when the extension was granted, said to the UK, don't waste this time. I think there is a real danger that the time does get wasted, though. There's clearly no majority in favour of any one option in Parliament at the moment. And it's quite hard to see that changing in the coming weeks because, if you're a sort of hard Brexiteer on the right of the Tory party, you're really holding out for a no-deal outcome. There's still a no-deal cliff edge. It's just been shifted to 6 months' time. On the other hand, it's really not in the Labour Party's interest to come up with some kind of compromise for Theresa May, because it would absolutely, first of all, split the Labour Party, and second of all, for Theresa May, it would be very, very difficult with her own Conservative Party. So it's quite hard to see how things move on unless there were something quite radical and drastic, like a confirmatory referendum on Theresa May's Brexit deal. I think you might see more MPs get behind that idea in the weeks to come as really the only way of breaking the political deadlock in which we find ourselves.
Mo, I wonder if you kind of agree with that assessment that it would take a kind of radical intervention for any kind of deal to get through.
Well, I mean, I think we definitely need to have some kind of breakthrough. This idea that the Easter break may help focus minds, I'm not sure. I don't think we've seen much of that happening so far. But I think things to watch coming up, certainly the European elections and the impact of that. There is still a chance. And I think Number 10 will be keen to highlight this, that we could still leave with a deal within the first few weeks of May, which would avoid having to take part in the European elections. So dangling that kind of spectre over people, I think is to be seen what impact that will have, and especially if MPs have to face their constituents 3 years on nearly and still have the conversation about, yes, we are putting people forward in the European elections. There's also local elections coming up as well, which, of course, yes, are meant to be based on local issues. However, I think there is a scenario here where people, because this will be the first time they can actually go to the ballot, will be expressing other frustrations or other views in that forum as well. So there could be other things that help to shift people's focus.
Help to shift focus. I just want to be clear. Are you really saying that people might end up voting for the withdrawal agreement, even though it's lost by record amounts previously, Mo?
I'm saying that this is what I think people in government will be thinking. I think if the vote comes back again, we could see the numbers become ever smaller because the wider options have disappeared as well. So the option is European election now, or the option is another 6-month deadline, which again doesn't actually take no deal off the table, even though Parliament have voted against it. So I think with the wider options disappearing, it could focus minds. But again, I don't think that is the only thing that could happen. That's not the only thing that people will be thinking about. The people who do not like the withdrawal agreement because of substance still will not like it, even though those numbers are changing.
Sonia, just to kind of run through the options, because I've been thinking a bit about this recently as well. I mean, you talked there about kind of radical things that could change the landscape. A referendum was one thing you said. I mean, you could also have a general election or a change of leader potentially. I just wonder, though, if you think one thing is slightly underpriced, which is just nothing really changing, us staggering on until October and then asking for another extension.
Sorry, could you just repeat that, Sophie? I didn't quite hear you.
I was just wondering, Sonia, if you think that there is a possibility that what might end up changing is not very much, and we just end up asking for another extension in October.
Do you know what? I think it's depressing, but I think it's an entirely conceivable outcome. As I said, I think the only way that things are going to change is as something quite fundamental changing, like a referendum. You could get a Tory leadership election, and a new leader might take the country to a general election. But if the parliamentary arithmetic stays the same, I think there's every chance actually that we get to sort of the 27th of October. There's a real lull in stuff happening around Brexit for the next kind of 4 or 5 months, and then MPs get sort of 2 or 3 weeks away from the deadline, and we're in exactly the same position. We're maybe having some indicative votes. I suspect actually there's quite a good chance that even though her party would quite like to get rid of her, Theresa may still be Prime Minister by the end of October. She's given all sorts of signals that she's going to be trying to cling on. So yes, Sophie, I think there's every chance that unless MPs really get their act together over the next couple of months and sort of agree to try something like a referendum or a citizens' assembly to break the deadlock, there's every chance we could be in exactly the same position in 6 months' time. And that's something that, the EU really don't want us to be in, but I think are quite worried about.
One thing that could end up shifting the landscape is a change of Conservative leader. Mo, your old boss has quite often talked about, isn't she? The latest thing I've heard is that Amber Rudd is going to go into alliance with Boris Johnson on a dream ticket called Bamba. Can you imagine that happening?
I've heard lots of things about Bamba as well, and then I think there was a bit of rowing back from that on the following day. I think, I don't think she's made any decisions yet. Clearly, there's lots of people putting themselves forward in various kind of double-page spreads and interviews showing their more human side. I also think, though, actually, at this moment in time, it's pretty self-indulgent to be thinking about that when actually we are in a national crisis, and people, even though we've got a bit of a breather now, people are rightly more concerned about what's going to happen to their jobs rather than who sits where around the cabinet table and what titles people have. And also, I think the point that Sonia made about arithmetic is quite important. A change of leader does not change the numbers in Parliament. It does not change the issues and the very different points of view within the Conservative Party. Similarly, there's different points of view in the Labour Party as well, but I don't think changing the figurehead actually resolves any of the more underlying fundamental problems about which way to proceed.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think if you look at what the EU has said, for example, they've been very, very clear that the withdrawal agreement is not for reopening. So even if the Conservatives were to elect a different leader, someone who takes a kind of tougher stance on Brexit, a hard Brexiter, perhaps someone like Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab, it's quite hard to see what that changes about the withdrawal agreement. The other thing is that, if there were a change of leader and then they wanted to get a mandate for a different type of Brexit, they'd have to hold a general election. And that's quite a big risk for the Conservative Party at the moment, and there will be Tory backbench MPs who might be quite worried about losing their seats, worried about a potential Corbyn surge, for example. So it's difficult to see, even if there were a change in Tory leader, how much would actually change given noises from the EU and given the fact that they would have to be comfortable triggering a general election with all the risks that involves.
One thing we haven't talked about is those cross-party talks. Mo, are you holding out any hope that a solution could be arrived at?
I personally think it's very unlikely. I think it's in neither party's interests to strike a compromise. I think if Theresa May were to strike a deal with the Labour Party and sort of get a softer version of her deal through with a softer political declaration, that would split her Conservative Party. And I think you would see people on the hard Eurosceptic flank of her party potentially upping sticks and leaving and walking away from the Conservative Party. And I think if Labour were to strike a deal as well, they've got two big problems. First of all, if there were a change of Conservative Prime Minister in the next 3-4 months, how do they hold, and there were a general election, how do they hold a future Parliament to account for any guarantees that Theresa May might give them now? Those guarantees aren't legally binding on a future Parliament. They can never be. And second, if Labour were to strike a deal with Theresa May, that would cause huge divides within the Labour shadow cabinet as well. And there are some members of the Labour shadow cabinet, MPs like Emily Thornberry, Tom Watson. These are really influential people that we're talking about on the Labour front bench, and they have made clear that they that any sort of deal must involve a confirmatory referendum on any deal going through. So I think if Jeremy Corbyn were to strike some sort of deal and it didn't involve a referendum, that would really split the Labour Party, and you might see more Labour MPs walking away from the Labour Party.
So you're pretty sceptical then about the outcome of those talks. Mo, are you any more optimistic?
I think I'm slightly more optimistic, because whilst I agree and share some of the concerns around the splits on both sides and the challenges that the Prime Minister faces and Jeremy Corbyn faces, ultimately this is Parliament is a numbers game, and anything that we do in terms of how we leave the EU and then any kind of future model of relationship will need legislation. It will need to get through Parliament. So the question still is, where is this parliamentary sweet spot that people can coalesce around? And I think certainly from the Prime Minister's perspective, yes, she has been walking this kind of political tightrope for a while about trying to keep both the Brexiteers and the former Remainers on side. But I think what we've seen, certainly we've moved away from the no deal is better than a bad deal mantra to the actions the last few weeks to try and get the extension again to avoid this cliff edge of a no deal scenario. So and also she has said that she will step down. So, she doesn't necessarily need to have the support of the ERG for kind of the longer term, for other things that she may want to do, all of which I think is important. On the Labour side as well, yes, as Sonia said, there are issues around some MPs not wanting a second referendum, questions around Labour's actual position on freedom of movement going forward. But actually, these are all kind of party political issues almost. What about the national interest, and what about actually people trying to come together to get something over the line in Parliament? Because anything will need the parliamentary numbers.
OK, thank you both very much for your analysis. Who knows where we'll be in another 6 months. Thank you.